Whether you're looking for answers to specific life questions or simply hoping to become the best version of you possible, welcome to the Mental Breakdown and Psychreg podcast, where we offer insight, information, and strategies based upon research and years of practice as psychologists. So sit back, have a listen, and get connected with our hosts, Dr. Berney Wilkinson and Dr. Richard Marshall. Welcome back. This week we are going to talk all about myths associated with the brain.
Well, more importantly, we're talking about the brain. We've been threatening to do this for a very long time.
Well, it's funny because we said that this week we're going to start our discussion about the brain, and we're going to kind of chip. And as we both started looking at different things, we're thinking, man, this is going to be so much.
It was funny because we were independently working. You know, you were working at home and I was working at home on Saturday afternoon. Mm-hmm. And we ended up with the same conclusion independently. That, wow, this is a huge topic that's not going to be easy to cover.
Where do we start?
So that's right.
So we're going to start with some of the myths.
Right. That's a real good place to start because there are these persistent myths that people have about the brain. Mm-hmm. And it's important to get rid of those, address those, and then move on to what we do know.
Right.
Mm-hmm. When we say what we do know, it means that there is research evidence, that carefully researched evidence of the things that we do know about the brain. But there are some things that have been around for about 100 years, some of them for 100 years, that are called neuromyths.
Right.
And it's time to dispel those.
Yeah. So we're going to start on this wonderful Monday morning.
On this journey. Wow.
We're going to start with the myth of the 10%.
That we use only 10% of our brains.
Right.
Interesting.
And it's so funny because, you know, and you know what, Richard, I didn't tell you this beforehand, but I think that this is going to be a bit of a generational thing. And here's what I mean. We have seen, even as recently as within the last couple of years, people, you know, in pop culture, like in movies and things like that, we'll have characters playing like famous neuroscientists, and they'll say, you know, we only use 10% of our brain. There was a movie called Lucy that had...
Did you see that movie?
Yeah.
I didn't see it.
And it had, you know, Morgan Freeman was in it, and Scarlett Johansson was in it. And I think it was Scarlett Johansson. Anyways, in it, Morgan Freeman plays this neuroscientist, and he says, you know, we only use 10% of our brain. Imagine what it would be like if we could use 100%. And so this is in popular culture, and a lot of people believe this. However, youth, some teens that I know, know that this is absolutely know that this is not true.
Oh, interesting.
And I'm wondering if this is going to be one of those things where, because many of us were taught that we only use 10% of our brain earlier in our educational careers, in high school and whatnot. But now it's been disproven, as we will talk about in just a moment. Right. So now we have a new generation of people coming through knowing that that's not true.
It may be because so many of the advances that we made in neuroscience were made in the 90s, the decade of the brain.
Right.
And they've been made in the last, through the 90s and into the 2000s. So it may be that we do have a generation that does understand that these are not true.
Right.
That research has shown them not to be true.
Yeah, in fact, I think it was a trailer for that movie where they showed that scene where Morgan Freeman says that, and my son was immediately turned off. He was like, "I'm not going to watch that movie.
That's not
because
true.
That's not true." Right. And you know,
well, I have to watch it because one of my dearest friends in the world, we call her Lucy, sort of a nickname for her, red hair and all that, and so in her honor, I'm going to have to watch the movie.
Well, there you go.
Yeah.
Well, so the myth is, and this I did learn. I didn't know that this started from a misquote of a.
That's what surprised me.
Right.
That this is just a little misunderstanding and people misquoting and.
Yeah. At some point, and I don't. Man, now I can't remember the guy's name, but he made a statement.
It was Lowell Thomas.
Right. Yeah. Made a statement that we use a relatively small portion of our brain at any time, and it was misquoted in a article
Right.
that said, "Oh, well, we only, according to him, we only use 10% of our brain."
Well, you know, it goes back to William James. Actually, he was the father, I guess you could call him the father of American psychology, brother of Henry James, the writer. But William James said, we only use 10% of our potential.
Right.
Okay, he was the one who said, we have this very small amount of our own abilities, that we're a very small amount of that. And somehow, and he said that in the late 1800s.
Right.
And somehow that started to get misquoted as we only use 10% of our brain.
Right.
And then Dale Carnegie wrote a book called How to Win Friends and Influence People.
Right.
Highly influential book. And the introduction of the book was written by a very popular adventurer and journalist. I remember Lowell Thomas. I remember the name. He had a TV show.
Right.
A High Adventure with Lowell Thomas or something. So he was a very popular TV personality, sort of the original, what was the guy from Australia? The crocodile, not Crocodile Dundee, but the guy from Australia.
Crocodile Hunter, Steve Irwin.
Steve Irwin. So he was kind of the original Steve Irwin. And he wrote the introduction to Dale Carnegie's book. And in the introduction of the book, he quoted or misquoted and said, we only use 10% of our brains.
Right.
Well, that was a highly successful book. And
Right.
so it was distributed widely. And so this urban legend that we only use 10% of our brain begins.
Right. And I think that an important piece to that is that at no time in our history did neuroscience support that idea.
No.
We've always known that wasn't true, but much like many of the other myths that we've talked about here on the podcast, whether it's the relationship between immunizations and autism or many other things, a myth begins with either a misquote or and sometimes an intentional misleading.
Right.
And then all of a sudden it explodes and it's just becomes part of the popular belief.
That's right. It gets embedded into the popular culture and people just talk about it as though it is true.
Right.
The early brain studies that were done, even back in the early 1900s, we knew that the brain had these primary and very active areas. For example, the primary visual area of the brain.
Right.
We knew that it was active, and we knew that motor areas were very active. So we knew that there were sensory areas in the back of the brain that were very active. We knew that there were motor areas in the front of the brain that were very active.
Right.
But there were pieces in between that didn't show the same activity. It's not that they were silent. It's that they were doing different kinds of things.
Right.
And we called those association areas. Alexander Luria, now we're talking about early 1900s, talked about this in neuropsychology, the early neuropsychology that said, we have these areas called association areas that link sensory with motor functions. It's not that they're not doing anything, they're doing something different than those primary areas. And people would say, oh, well, these areas are then quiet. In other words, we're not using them.
Right.
No, we are using them, but we're using them for different things.
Right.
And that was another contribution to this idea that we don't use all of our brain.
Right.
Frequently, audiences or even graduate students will ask the question, well, do we really only use 10% of our brain? And I say to them, I hope not. Because if you're only using 10% of your brain, you're probably dead.
Right.
I mean, it doesn't take a lot of damage to have catastrophic results.
Right.
A tiny stroke can leave you with functional deficits. And we're not talking about losing 5 or 10%. We're talking about a tiny, tiny piece of brain tissue will lead to catastrophic functional impairments.
Right. Yeah, I think that's, one of the ways that we know that we use more than 10% of our brain is that pure fact right there, that it doesn't take much damage at all to have profound impairments or profound effects on our functioning.
Right.
I remember I once watched a documentary and I used this often in discussions with students that it was a documentary about brain function, and this guy was talking about how he was on his way to work one morning, and he was walking to work, and he got a headache.
Right.
And he didn't think much of it, but it was a pretty excruciating headache. But he continued to go, and he got to work, and he remembers walking up because he was the manager of a supermarket. And as he was walking up, he looked up and he could recognize the letters on the wall, but he couldn't read it.
Right.
And he thought that was odd, as I think most of us would. And he went inside, and because he was the manager, he went into the office, and he had paperwork to do, and he remembers looking at the paperwork and recognizing letters, but couldn't read the words on the paper. And his headache was continuing. So he went to the hospital, and they did some scans and everything, and they found that there was a slight stroke in a particular, very specific portion of his brain.
Tiny area of the brain.
And, and it created this massive dysfunction to where he literally couldn't read. He couldn't assemble the letters together to make meaning.
Right.
And so he, the issues associated with the stroke resolved, and he was able to read again.
Right.
But that was, one major indication that a very small,
tiny pinpoint of blood getting where it shouldn't be will cause those kind of catastrophic results.
Right.
No, and it doesn't take a large. I mean, you might not even be able to see it with the naked eye.
Right.
It's tiny lesions like that, tiny injuries to the brain. Look at concussions. Where you wouldn't even know that a concussion occurred.
Right.
And without sophisticated, and you may not be able to see it on sophisticated neuroimaging.
Right.
But a concussion can cause major damage to your brain.
Right.
So no, the whole world of neurosurgery or wounds, head wounds from soldiers or athletes, gladiators. That's when we first discovered the brain behavior relationships was from the gladiators.
Right.
They'd go out intact and come back and couldn't move the left side of their body.
Right.
Well, there's the injury.
Right.
So no, we have plenty of evidence, irrefutable evidence, that we use far more than 10% of our brain.
Yeah.
Judy Willis is a neurologist and educator. She went back and got her master's degree in education and teaches 8th grade during the school year and does neurology during the summer. Odd twist. And she said the same thing, that even when you're reading, information is flowing all over the brain, and it's flowing not only around the cortex, but it's moving up and down, top to bottom, through the subcortical structures that give it meaning, and emotional value. And she said, no, the whole brain is lighting up all the time during reading.
Right.
So, yeah, it's pretty clear that we use most of our brain for most tasks.
Right. Yeah, and I think that, when you look at, I think that's one of the ways that people get confused when they look at neuroimaging pictures.
Yes, that's right.
And it's like, okay, so everything's dark and there's these colorful areas. Well, that's done through a sophisticated algorithm that says all these other brain regions are active, but they're active in each picture exactly the same way. And so we just dull those so that we can see where those differences are.
And that's a snapshot.
Right.
That lovely colorful picture that you see is a snapshot. But if you turned on the movie, you'd see that color changing and moving throughout the brain as information moves from back to front and up and down and front to back. And the picture is constantly changing. It's similar to a weather map. You can take a picture of a weather map, or you can watch it over time.
Right.
And it's constantly changing.
Yeah.
But yes, you're using all of your brain all of the time, even when you're sleeping.
Yep. So,
but not during a coma.
Oh, well,
that's another topic.
We'll talk about that another time.
But let's get rid of the 10% myth.
Right.
Okay, let's just get rid of it. It's not true. There's no evidence. And nobody who has ever studied the brain believes that we only use 10%.
That's right.
Been true for 100 years. More than 100 years.
Or for as long as
I've been alive. Don't say it. Don't say it.
As long as we've been humans, we've been using more than 10% of our brain.
Yes, we have.
All right, that is it for today. Until next time, stay happy, stay healthy, and forget to be afraid. Thanks for sharing this episode of the Mental Breakdown and Psychreg podcast. Be sure to check out the show notes for links to follow us on Twitter and subscribe to our YouTube channel, where you will find all of our previous podcasts and much more. We would be honored if you would become a patron through patreon.com, where any donation you can manage will go to the development and creation of more content. Just visit patreon.com/thementalbreakdown for more information. Thanks again for listening. Have an awesome day, and we look forward to being back in your feed tomorrow morning.